Heroes don't always come adorned with medals. Sometimes they arrive wearing patches. Sometimes they charge toward tempests, seeking not recognition, but the joy in a child's eyes. This tale isn't about celebrity. It's about devotion, about the roar of engines that arrives when quiet becomes unbearable. Please stay until the conclusion. Before we start, I wish you comfort today, mental peace, and an unexpected moment of beauty. Please share in the comments where you're joining us from and which phrase resonated most deeply with you. The young boy positioned himself at the hospital window, clutching a single wish as carefully as one holds a prayer. Dawn had just arrived, and the heavens seemed determined to restrain an approaching tempest. 9-year-old Caleb bore tubes protruding from his chest and intravenous lines in both arms. Yet his determination remained unbroken. Not at this moment. Not while his faith persisted in what he termed loud magic, the special power that only motorcycles could deliver. His father, Joe, remained close by. A tradesman who worked with metal, a single parent shaped by devastating loss. Words came sparingly these days, particularly since the medical professionals delivered news that the growth had relocated. This operation would represent Caleb's final opportunity. Yet even then, optimism arrived with conditions attached. That morning, Caleb's voice fractured when he expressed his desire, speaking just above a murmur. I simply need to witness one Harley before I undergo surgery. Father, just a single one, so my dreams can grow louder. Joe acknowledged with a nod, his jaw tightening like corroded metal. He no longer rode motorcycles, hadn't mounted one since his wife's passing. However, that evening, after his son drifted into sleep, Joe accessed a storage space he'd avoided for years. Contained within was a patch, its red and white colors, diminished by time, a fragment of his history and potentially his son's destiny. He retrieved his phone, examined names he'd distanced himself from long ago, and contacted one number he'd promised himself would never be necessary again. The contact was Wolf, and the events that followed would resonate across every road from Maine to Monterey. Wolf hadn't received communication from Joe in more than 10 years. Not since the patch had been surrendered, the insignia returned, and the distance between them expanded into coldness. Yet when that telephone rang and Wolf recognized the caller, he responded immediately. He didn't inquire about Joe's well-being. Such questions weren't required. A man's voice transmits sorrow, like gravel grinding through machinery, and Joe's voice barely functioned. His words were straightforward. My son has one final journey remaining in him. He wishes to see a Harley. Only one, tomorrow morning. Wolf didn't reply instantly. His breathing could be heard breaking through the connection. Then he declared, "What's the child's location?" "St. Jude's, room 402. Quietness ensued. Heavy. Then Wolf emitted a low rumble resembling an aged motor coming to life. "I'll take care of it." That evening, Wolf retrieved his own patch, extracted a container from beneath his bed, and initiated a series of calls. Not messages, not electronic correspondence, telephone calls, because authentic riders don't utilize group messaging for matters of this significance. He contacted Bear in Montana, Diesel in Kansas, and Goose Down in Tucson. Each conversation contained identical words. A brother's child needs to experience thunder. Tomorrow morning, St. Jude's. Nobody posed questions. Some simply responded, "I'm en route." Others whispered, "How critical is it?" Wolf never provided answers. He merely specified the time, 8:00 a.m. precisely, and instructed them to arrive respectfully. No tire burnouts, no banners, simply appear with dignity. By midnight, information had traveled beyond state boundaries. Aging engines roared to life. Men embraced their spouses and prepared in silence. Some hadn't ridden in years, suffering from damaged knees and arthritis-stiffened hands. Yet they still fastened their boots as though preparing for combat. And in certain ways, it was combat. A battle against emptiness, against grief, against a world that occasionally forgets the meaning of allegiance. Joe barely experienced sleep that evening. He remained stationed beside Caleb's hospital bed, observing the rising and falling of his son's chest, synchronizing it with his own damaged heart's rhythm. Every electronic beep from the monitoring devices felt like a hammer striking his ribs. Every flutter in Caleb's eyelids awakened a fear no man could seal away. He murmured stories to maintain the boy's dreams. Narratives of the former crew, extended roads, desert temperatures, and chrome surfaces that gleamed beneath moonlight. Caleb displayed a smile during sleep as though he were already accompanying spirits. Outside, the wind intensified. The nurse assigned to duty, a woman named Linda, observed Joe through the glass partition. She entered and presented him with coffee. He declined it, stating only, "You may want to observe through that window come morning." She didn't comprehend, but nodded in acknowledgement. Joe leaned toward his son and expressed one final thought before succumbing to a light slumber. "Tomorrow, child, you'll experience thunder." Meanwhile, throughout the nation, highways gradually filled with riders. No organized procession, no structured arrangement, merely a current of engines drawn toward a single location on the map. Some traveled alone, others in pairs or trios. Truck drivers yielded the right lane. Law enforcement didn't make inquiries. They rode with headlights illuminated and hearts resolute. At truck stops, men exchanged maps and conversed quietly. St. Jude's, 8 o'clock. Bikers acknowledged with nods. Some wiped away tears upon seeing the patch. This wasn't about public perception. This concerned something more ancient, something hallowed. By 4 o'clock a.m., the hospital's perimeter was humming with activity. Engines idled quietly in alleyways, parking areas, and fuel stations. Men waited with hands positioned on handlebars, gazes fixed toward the horizon. Not a single horn, not a single utterance, only chrome, leather, and intention. The sun ascended slowly as though aware that something sacred was about to transpire. At 7:42 a.m., the initial Harley arrived outside St. Jude's. Wolf led the formation, accompanied by Bear and Diesel. Their motorcycles didn't scream. They emitted subdued rumbles that ascended the hospital walls like a hymn composed of steel and petroleum. The nurses were first to take notice. Linda's coffee slipped from her grasp when she glanced through the window. Rows upon rows of motorcycles, gleaming fuel tanks, worn saddles, patched jackets occupied the entire block. Then the subsequent one, then the one beyond. By 8:05, over 10,000 riders had assembled. They arrived from every state, every chapter, every background. Veterans wearing Vietnam identification tags, young prospects on borrowed motorcycles. Even competing motorcycle clubs stood adjacent to one another, nodding in wordless solidarity. No music performed, no chanting, only the profound guttural hum of thousands of hearts pulsing in synchronization. Inside, Caleb awakened, his eyes opened to illumination streaming through the curtain. Joe lifted him carefully, intravenous lines and all, and transported him toward the window. The boy's breath halted. All he could articulate was, "Father, there are so many." Joe knelt beside him, arms encircling his son like protective armor. "They came for you, buddy, every single individual." Below, a line of riders removed their helmets in unison. Wolf raised a single hand, a subtle signal. The engines ceased. Silence. And then one motorcycle revved slowly, respectfully, like a heart awakening. Then another, and another, until 10,000 Harleys roared once, not in disorder, but in tribute. It was thunder enveloped in affection, and the boy's eyes filled with tears that gleamed like chrome beneath the morning sun. The hospital staff retreated. Some placed hands over their hearts. Some wept openly. Even the custodian dropped his cleaning equipment and whispered, "I've never witnessed anything resembling this." Joe held his son's fragile body in his lap as though it were constructed of paper and prayer. Caleb didn't speak extensively. His voice caught somewhere between wonder and oxygen, but his hand, pale and trembling, lifted toward the glass and executed a slow wave. That's all it required. The men below responded in the only manner they understood. They didn't wave in return. They didn't shout or rev louder. They removed their jackets. One by one, riders peeled away their cuts, their colors, their sacred second skin, and elevated them high like flags for the fallen. 10,000 patches rose into the atmosphere like a battlefield salute. Wolf removed his own and placed it gently upon the ground. Then he knelt beside it, a gesture that communicated to every man surrounding him, "This isn't about us, this is about him." Tears descended from eyes that hadn't cried in years. Bikers with calloused hands and troubled pasts stood motionless like stone guardians. Inside, Caleb looked at Joe and expressed the only thing he could manage. "They're angels, Father, genuine ones." Joe bit his lip, nodded, then whispered, "They've always been, just misunderstood." A nurse captured a photograph, just one. That photograph would achieve viral status within hours, though it was never intended for that purpose. He didn't request fame. He simply wanted his son to see one motorcycle, but life and brotherhood had alternative plans, and outside that hospital, the world rotated slightly slower that morning, because for a moment, time had nothing more important to do than stand still for a boy and his wish. Following the salute, the engines cut again. Wolf advanced forward, holding his helmet beneath one arm. He looked upward toward Caleb's window and raised 2 fingers to his temple, then outward toward the boy, a biker's sign of respect, of honor. Joe understood what it signified. So did Caleb. Then Wolf indicated his motorcycle, nodded once. The crowd separated, silent as falling snow. He mounted the Harley, ignited it, and commenced the slowest ride of his existence. A crawl across the parking lot beneath Caleb's window. Behind him, one by one, the remaining riders followed. They didn't race, they didn't rev, they glided. Chrome and thunder moving like a prayer circle surrounding the building. A nurse opened Caleb's window just sufficiently so he could hear the hum. His hands trembled as he gripped the blanket. Tears ran down his cheeks like oil down an aged tank, slow, honest, and free. Joe knelt beside him, whispering the names of the motorcycles as they passed. "That's a 76 Shovelhead. That one's a Fat Bob. That's a Road Glide, just like mine used to be." Caleb didn't speak, simply observed, memorizing every line and color. His lips moved, silently counting. He stopped at one number, 10,000. 10,000 men who didn't know him and appeared anyway. For him, for Joe, for a cause greater than ego. Below, an aged biker named Stickers held up a handmade sign. "One ride, one boy, all heart." No one applauded, no one cheered. But damn if the atmosphere didn't feel weighted with something holy. When the final rider passed beneath his window, Caleb finally spoke, voice parched, barely more than a whisper. "Do they know how much this means, Father?" Joe nodded slowly, swallowing the obstruction in his throat. "They know, son. Hell, I believe they feel it more than they can express." The hospital room carried the scent of antiseptic and motor oil now, a strange combination that somehow made it feel less sterile, more human. Even the walls seemed warmer. A nurse brought in a small black vest. On the back was a patch stitched with care. "Little Rider, F.A. Honorary." Caleb's eyes widened. Linda knelt down, brushing his hair back gently. Some of the riders created it overnight in the cafeteria. Said they couldn't sleep knowing you didn't have your own. She adjusted the patch with maternal precision. "There you go, baby. Now you match." Joe watched silently, his hands clenched into fists to prevent them from shaking. Outside, some riders remained, guarding the entrance like sentinels. One held a guitar. He strummed it gently, soft blues drifting up the concrete walls. It wasn't for display. It was a lullaby for steel hearts, a song for the boy in the window who had stirred a nation. Doctors and surgeons paused mid-round to observe. Hardened men stood in doorway, hats over their hearts. A janitor wept in the stairwell. Joe finally sat. His legs gave out, but his soul felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. Because grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it rides up on 2 wheels, parks beside you, and says nothing. Just sits in the storm with you. At noon, Wolf returned to the nurse's desk. In his hand was a worn envelope sealed with grease-stained fingers. "For the boy," he said. Then he turned to depart. The nurse called after him. "Wait, don't you want to say goodbye?" He paused. Goodbyes aren't always meant to be spoken. Sometimes they're meant to be felt. Then he put on his helmet and disappeared into the rumble. Inside the envelope was a letter handwritten in ink so unsteady it appeared tattooed by time. "Little Rider, you reminded us of who we used to be. Not kings, not rebels, just men who loved the road and the people we ride for. You made 10,000 old boys believe in something again. If that isn't a miracle, I don't know what is. If you ride again, even if just in dreams, ride free and know we've got your six. Always ride safe, kid. Wolf, AFA." The letter was folded gently and placed beside Caleb's pillow. He traced the words with his fingers, lips moving as he read it repeatedly. Joe leaned in close. "You okay, buddy?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah, I think I am now." That afternoon, the doctor entered. "We're ready, Joe. Time for pre-op." Joe stood and squeezed his son's hand. Caleb looked toward the window one more time. The motorcycles were gone now, but in the distance, he could still hear the echo, a soft growl like the sound of angels clearing a path. And that's how he went into surgery, not with fear, but with the thunder of brotherhood in his heart. Joe paced the waiting room like a soldier marching out grief. He couldn't sit, couldn't eat, just stared at the floor tiles, counting cracks, praying they didn't signify anything. The waiting room was quiet, too quiet for a man accustomed to the sound of machines and fire. Linda sat nearby. She brought coffee, but Joe let it go cold. She offered to call someone. He shook his head. They already came. The surgeon entered 3 hours later, scrub-stained, eyes heavy, Joe's breath caught. He didn't ask, just stood. The doctor smiled, small, tired, but genuine. "He's still here." Joe collapsed into the chair, hands over his face, silent sobs, the kind only a father can understand when the worst doesn't happen. "He's strong," the doctor added, "but that kid had something with him in there. Don't know what it was, never seen anything like it." Joe whispered, "Thunder." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Joe just smiled. "Never mind." Later, as night fell and machines ticked more slowly, Caleb stirred. He was groggy, stitched, and medicated. Joe leaned close. "You made it, champ." Caleb's first words were a whisper. "Did they really come?" Joe laughed through his tears. "They did. You made the earth shake, son." He held up the vest. Caleb's smile was crooked, sleepy, but proud. Outside the window, a small wooden cross stood in the flower bed, freshly planted, leather straps tied around it. A nurse found it later. No note, just a carving in the wood, for the one who reminded us to ride like it matters. 3 weeks later, Caleb walked out of St. Jude's with a cane in one hand and a helmet in the other. The helmet wasn't for now, but it would be one day. Joe wheeled him to the parking lot. The air smelled like fall, sharp, cool, and full of memory. Waiting by the curb was Wolf. He didn't say much, just leaned against his bike, arms crossed, smirk in place. "Figured the kid might want to ride," he muttered. Joe blinked. "You serious?" Wolf handed over a key. "That old road glide of yours. We found it, fixed her up, brought her back." Joe swallowed hard. "You didn't have to." Wolf shrugged. "None of us had to, but that ain't the point, is it?" Caleb's eyes went wide when he saw the motorcycle. "She's beautiful." Joe knelt next to him. "Are you prepared to hit the road, partner?" Caleb grinned. "Not at this moment, but it won't be long." Wolf gave an approving nod. "Until that day comes, keep the vest near you, and don't forget, the open road is always there for you." They observed as he departed, one rider, one machine, disappearing into a sunset that resembled a vow. Joe lifted the child and positioned him carefully on the road glide seat. For a brief moment, Caleb shut his eyes. The motor wasn't turned on, but in his imagination, he was already cruising, and trailing behind him, 10,000 motorcycles followed without a sound. At home, Caleb's bedroom had been transformed. The cartoon posters and plastic playthings were gone. In their stead, a shadow box hung on the wall, positioned directly above his headboard. Within it rested a small vest, an honorary AFA patch, and a carefully folded photograph. The image captured only footwear and polished metal. the front line of motorcycles outside St. Jude's. There were no visible faces, no identifying names, yet to Caleb, it meant the world. Joe often caught him gazing at it in the mornings. The boy wouldn't offer much commentary, just sit there wearing a smile far too expansive for his small frame, as though his little heart bore the weight of 100 motorcyclists. There was a newfound strength in Caleb, not physical strength in his body, that would require more time, but in his essence, something unwavering. One evening, Joe discovered him drawing in his sketchbook, a crude illustration of a child astride a motorcycle, a patched vest billowing in the breeze. "What's this supposed to be?" Joe inquired, dropping to one knee. Caleb glanced upward. "That's me in the future." Joe fought back the emotion rising in his throat. "You will be, won't you? There's no question about it." Caleb beamed. "And I'm going to ride alongside them, the ones who came for me." Joe responded with a slow nod, resting his hand on his son's shoulder. "I believe they would be honored to ride with you." On the dresser sat a modest wooden container, hand-carved with simple craftsmanship. It contained the letter from Wolf, still creased, still frequently revisited. Adjacent to it, a miniature toy motorcycle that hadn't been moved from Caleb's nightstand since his hospital stay. Every element in the room now conveyed a narrative, not merely one of suffering and healing, but of a child who had caused giants to redirect their paths. And although the nighttime hours remained difficult when the breeze blew in just the right way, Caleb was certain he could still perceive it, the deep rumble of far-off engines calling his name. Half a year later, Caleb's complexion had been restored. His lower limbs had grown more powerful, his gait more secure. The walking stick still accompanied him, though primarily from routine. What remained unchanged was the intensity in his gaze. Joe brought him to the county fair that spring season, just the pair of them, reminiscent of earlier days, though everything seemed altered now. People knew who they were. Some stared and pointed. A handful of unfamiliar faces approached tentatively, inquiring, "Is he the child?" Joe would acknowledge with a single nod. "Yes, that's my son." But Caleb never allowed the attention to inflate his ego. He would simply offer a courteous smile and ask whether they owned a motorcycle. That particular day, the local Hells Angels chapter had established a display near the livestock stalls, a charitable endeavor, conducting a raffle for a vintage 1958 panhead to benefit veterans' children. When the motorcyclists spotted Caleb, the entire pavilion fell silent. Then a towering man with work-worn hands came forward. His identification badge read Red Dog. He crouched down, positioning himself at the boy's eye level. "Well, see what the wind has delivered." Caleb acknowledged him with a shy nod. "Hello." Red Dog reached into a duffel bag and extracted a small present wrapped in bandana fabric. "Some of the brothers in Arizona forwarded this for you. They said they couldn't be here personally, but wanted you to receive it." Inside was a chrome nameplate, carefully engraved. It read, "Little Rider Forever 10K. Joe's hands shook as he examined it. Caleb's remained steady. He raised the nameplate high, then before the assembled gathering, he attached it to the belt loop of his jeans. Nobody applauded, but every man present in that tent removed his hat, a moment of wordless respect, not simply for the child, but for what he represented to them. That even the most boisterous men harbor the most tender hearts. By the time July arrived, the cane remained at home. Caleb was ambulatory on his own, still gradual, still cautious, but with a determination that only emerges in someone who had stood at death's threshold. Joe refrained from pressing him. He simply observed, quietly amazed, and maintained the motorcycle engine. One Saturday morning, the home telephone rang. It was Wolf calling. "Are you occupied?" he asked. Joe smiled in response. "That depends on what you need. We're organizing a ride, a genuinely quiet one." A few of the brothers thought perhaps the boy might want to participate. Joe's eyes shot toward the garage where the aged Road Glide sat, polished to a mirror finish. He would appreciate that. An hour afterward, they were on the move. Joe donned the old denim jacket. Caleb sat secured behind him, goggles oversized for his face, arms wrapped tightly around his father's midsection. They rendezvoused with 30 motorcycles just beyond the town limits. No banners displayed, no speeches delivered, just an acknowledging nod from Wolf and the open road stretching ahead. They traveled for hours through dirt-covered roads, pastoral valleys, and extended winding sections of two-lane highway. Caleb remained silent throughout. There was no need for words. Joe sensed it in the grip of his son's hands, in the way he naturally leaned into every curve. At one moment, Wolf positioned himself beside them, offered the boy a knowing wink, then twisted the throttle and accelerated for Ward. Caleb released a genuine laugh, the variety of laughter that brings tears to grown men hiding behind sunglasses. By the time the sun descended, they arrived at an aged war memorial outside a long-forgotten mining settlement. The riders halted, dismounted, and maintained silence. Wolf gestured toward Caleb. The boy advanced forward, his limp now barely perceptible. He laid a single rose upon the memorial stone. Nobody uttered a sound, but within that quietness, every man recalled what he had battled for and what he continued to believe in. Somewhere in the distance behind them, a coyote howled, and above that sound, the wind murmured like a throttle, gradually easing into the darkness. In the corridor of Joe's humble residence hung a frame, not oversized, not elaborate, simply wood encasing glass. But what it preserved was beyond price. A photograph captured by the nurse at St. Jude's, the one depicting Caleb waving from his window, and below him extended an ocean of motorcycles. 10,000 men with faces upturned toward a boy they had never encountered. Caleb walked past it daily on his route to school now, still favoring one leg slightly, but always standing tall, always carrying himself with dignity. He would pause occasionally, just for an instant, gazing up at the frame as though it contained more than a mere memory. It contained evidence that goodness still existed in the world. Joe observed him once, remaining undetected. The boy pressed his fingertips to the glass, whispered something inaudible, then continued onward. Joe never inquired about what was said. Certain things are intended to remain between a child and his guardian angels. In the corner of the frame was an additional patch. This one had been delivered months later from overseas. It arrived with a message that stated, "From the brothers in Australia, we ride in his honor as well." Joe had studied that message for countless hours, folding and unfolding it, reading the words until the ink became blurred. Because sometimes a legacy isn't constructed from fame or symbols or crossing finish lines first. It's built from the lives you awaken simply by demonstrating courage. At his school, Caleb delivered a presentation on one occasion. The topic was about a time when someone transformed your existence. The instructor anticipated a narrative about a physician or an athletic coach, but Caleb rose to his feet, cleared his throat deliberately, and stated, "Once, 10,000 motorcyclists appeared just to help me feel powerful, and they never uttered a word, yet I understood everything." The classroom became hushed, and not a single child laughed, because even young people recognize this truth. When thunder travels in silence, you pay attention. Every year following that event, on the precise anniversary of the hospital ride, Joe and Caleb organized a modest assembly. They named it the Patch Ride. No prominent signage, no media presence, just several dozen riders from surrounding communities. They would arrive in the early hours, consuming black coffee from weathered thermoses, and travel the extended route past St. Jude's. Caleb would now lead the procession, not operating his own motorcycle, not quite yet, but fastened securely behind Joe. The honorary vest never left his shoulders. The V fit snugly against his back. The journey would unfold slowly with engines running quietly. Afterward, they would circle the parking lot where everything started and stop beneath the same window that once framed a young boy's last hope. Linda, who had since retired, arrived every year carrying cookies and tears. She would embrace Caleb as though he were her own child. During one visit, a newly hired nurse emerged, looking puzzled. "Who are they here to see?" Linda offered a gentle smile. "They're not visiting, they're honoring a memory." And that's exactly what they did. Each time the motorcycles idled, the riders removed their helmets and gazed upward. No speech was necessary. The wind delivered the words they would never voice aloud. One particular year brought rain. It made no difference. They rode through the downpour like a baptism ceremony. Drenched leather, gleaming chrome, hearts thundering. Caleb continued to grow older. His legs developed greater strength. The vest began fitting tightly across his shoulders, yet he never abandoned wearing it. As for Joe, he aged as well, more slowly, more quietly, but carrying a pride that enveloped him like the warmth of exhaust heat during winter. When the final rider departed each year, they would place something modest near the flowerbed cross. A keychain, a patch, a bolt salvaged from an aging engine. It transformed into a shrine, not commemorating loss, but celebrating the kind of love that arrives with thunder and departs in whispers. The same window that once framed a young boy's last hope. Linda, who had since retired, arrived every year carrying cookies and tears. She would embrace Caleb as though he were her own child. During one visit, a newly hired nurse emerged looking puzzled. "Who are they here to see?" Linda offered a gentle smile. "They're not visiting. They're honoring a memory," and that's exactly what they did. Each time the motorcycles idled, the riders removed their helmets and gazed upward. No speech was necessary. The wind delivered the words they would never voice aloud. One particular year brought rain. It made no difference. They rode through the downpour like a baptism ceremony. Drenched leather, gleaming chrome, hearts thundering. Caleb continued to grow older. His legs developed greater strength. The vest began fitting tightly across his shoulders, yet he never abandoned wearing it. As for Joe, he aged as well, more slowly, more quietly, but carrying a pride that enveloped him like the warmth of exhaust heat during winter. When the final rider departed each year, they would place something modest near the flowerbed cross. A keychain, a patch, a bolt salvaged from an aging engine. It transformed into a shrine, not commemorating loss, but celebrating the kind of love that arrives with thunder and departs in whispers. The journey northward was frigid, rain-drenched plains, mountain air that stung like memories. Yet neither man voiced complaints. In Montana, the campsite was intimate. Simply a fire, several tents, and Wolf Spike positioned like an altar. He was present, elderly and coughing but wearing a smile. "I figured if I'm going to ride into the next world," he said, "I want it to resemble this." That evening, stories flowed like whiskey. Accounts of rides gone awry, brothers long laid to rest, and patches earned without fanfare. Wolf turned toward Caleb and handed him something folded. Inside, a photograph from St. Jude's, with writing on the reverse. "When the world forgets, ride louder." Joe placed a hand upon Wolf's shoulder. No words passed between them, only a firm squeeze, a rider's method of saying farewell without making it permanent. Wolf passed peacefully in the morning hours, head resting against his saddlebag, hands folded over a flask. They ignited a fire for him that night and released his vest to the wind. No formal ceremony, no spoken eulogy, just 200 motorcycles, tires crushing gravel, and one young man standing resolute in the ashes, clutching the patch that once made the world pause. Caleb spoke, not with theatrical grandeur, but with raw authenticity. He told me, "We don't ride to be loud. We ride because no one else can carry the silence like we do." Then he revved his engine once. The others joined in. They rode out from the Montana night with headlights extinguished, guided by stars and stories only they could comprehend. Back home, Joe mounted Wolf's patch in the garage. Beside it, a note written in Wolf's handwriting. "He's yours now. Ride him right." Joe never discussed it openly, but sometimes neighbors discovered him in that garage with his hand pressed against the patch as though it were a military decoration. Caleb rode more frequently now, not seeking attention, but preserving remembrance. At every rest stop, someone recognized his name, yet he never identified himself as anything beyond just a kid who once caused 10,000 men to appear. Years advanced. Caleb grew into his boots. Joe grew into his retirement. His hair turned silver. His voice grew softer. But that fire, that persistent fire, never abandoned his chest. On his 65th birthday, Caleb surprised him with a gift, a reconstructed 76 shovelhead, polished chrome, identical gas tank design from the original St. Jude's ride. Joe ran his hand along the tank's surface. He whistled appreciatively. You trying to make an old man weep? Caleb smiled warmly. Just giving you one more road. They took it together. 2 motorcycles now, not one following the other, side by side. They rode at a leisurely pace, no urgency, past the hospital, past the flowerbed cross, past every memory that ever roared beneath their boots. At sunset, they pulled off near the ridge, the same location where they once shared black coffee and a quiet truth. Joe gazed outward, moisture gathering in his eyes. You gave me more than I ever deserved, son. Caleb shook his head in disagreement. You gave me everything. They sat on the grass, observing birds diving like engines, listening to the breeze bending like a prayer. And when they rode homeward, they did so without helmets, because certain rides aren't about regulations. They're about remembering your identity. Years afterward, a young father entered a roadside diner with a small boy accompanying him. The child wore a vest, one just slightly too large, with stitching on the back. Little Rider Legacy Chapter. Behind the counter, the waitress smiled. You from around here? The man nodded affirmatively. My dad was. He gestured toward a photograph hanging at an angle on the wall. Faded from sunlight exposure, but still commanding. It depicted a boy waving from a hospital window, and below, a wall of chrome extending beyond the frame's edge. The boy tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, is that really you? He knelt down to meet his son's gaze. Yeah, that was me, a long time ago. I asked to see one bike before my surgery, and 10,000 showed up in silence. The boy's eyes expanded with wonder. Why? The man smiled knowingly. Because sometimes when men believe in something, they don't require words. They just ride. They left a tip, a generous one, and affixed a sticker to the door on their way out. FFA, always for family, always. As they rode away, a solitary rider observed from the gas station across the street. Helmet raised, eyes creased with time, he smiled, then kicked up his stand and followed them toward the horizon, maintaining just enough distance to keep the legacy advancing. Because in a world saturated with noise, there are still those who choose to ride in silence. For the boy who once believed thunder could save him. If this story awakened something within you, if it reminded you of a brother, a ride, or a moment you never found words for, share it. Because some stories aren't for views, they're for healing. Like, subscribe, and share this ride. Ride safe, ride proud, and never ride alone.